This next section is methods of gathering data. So if you thought going over rules and learning how to fill out a template was fun, this is going to be even more. So the process of trying to complete the inventory, especially with the idea that record review is a must and that this is what you must start with. So we kind of devoted a section just to that. This isn't an do-all, end-all to how you're going to capture all of your data, but these are more or less between the rules of what you're supposed to look at and then some additional ideas of what you can look for. So we'll go through all of that. So what TCQ is looking for is the water system and customer side. So a lot of this is going to be repetition. I don't know if it's like anyone else. For me, I have to have it be told to me repeated times for it to actually stick. So you're going to see a lot of things in this particular section that Elston or Philip have already went over, but we're going to make sure we hammer it home. So we are looking for water system side and customer side. And they have to be listed as one of four categories or statuses: the lead, galvanized requiring replacement, non-lead, and then lead status unknown. So just to clarify, I know for water systems, being a previous operator as well, a service line for me was from the distribution to the meter. That was a service line. The definition of service line for EPA in this particular case is from the distribution main line to the inlet of the home. So just to clarify and make sure we all understand, that's what we're referring to when we say a service line. It includes the customer side as well. It is not to say that it is utility's responsibility for the entire service line as far as ownership. It is still divided however you have in your particular utility, your system. In most cases, it is a water system responsibility from the main to the meter, and then the customer responsibility from the meter to the home or building. But in the case of lead service line inventory, you are responsible for gathering the material information for the entire service line. So just to clarify that. It's good practice to have in your policies, in your tariff, in your service agreement, in some place of documentation of how you classify the ownership. Just in case you don't, it's always good practice for that. I know I used to get a lot of calls about, well, there's a leak on my side, you're the water system, you should fix it. Clearly state that it's their responsibility past the meter. So just kind of an FYI on that. So the process of doing the inventory is a multi-step approach. The first two is what we're working with initially. You have to do a preliminary records review and then also looking at community records. The idea from TCQ is that we want to do everything based on paperwork, as much as possible anyway, before you go down to step 3 and further on to do on-site investigation or visual examinations. So record review, as we've said multiple times, that is a must. Sure didn't pass anything. Under the LCRR, initial inventory must include all service lines. So as we explained, the entire service line, regardless of ownership. The initial inventory must use historical records, so you have to do a record review, as we've mentioned multiple times. Non-lead must be determined to be non-lead or galvanized requiring replacement through evidence-based records, investigations, methods, techniques. You have to prove up to show that it is in fact non-lead, not just a matter of, I'm pretty sure that it's all PVC. There has to be some kind of records that you are reviewing to state that. If the water system is unable to demonstrate that the galvanized service line, say on the customer side, was never downstream of a lead service line, then you must assume that the upstream service line was in fact lead. Yes?
When you refer to record review, like let's just say we have in order to prove that it is PVC or polyethylene tube, so we have the as-bills, right? But most of the as-bills don't necessarily show that it's a service line from the corporation to the meter to the angle stop, right? But it shows it on the detail. Is that something that we can?
As long as you have a record of it to show that that is materials that were used, that is a record.
Okay.
Yeah.
Customer service inspections.
Yeah, Alex is beating me to one of my slides, but yes, customer service inspections. So I do want to rehash this last one again. So if the water system is unable to determine the downstream side, so the customer side, if they have a galvanized line and you don't have documentation as built, something to show that when the service line on the public water system side was never lead, then you have to assume that it may have been lead. So now that galvanized line on the customer side is presumed to be a GRR, galvanized requirement replacement. So this is, I highlighted it because it is kind of a sticking point. If you see a customer line that has galvanized piping, it is going to be a little bit difficult to be able to track down records to show, if it's been some time, that it was never a service line. So just keep that in mind. If you don't have anything to prove up the public water system side that it was never lead, then if you have a galvanized customer line, you have to assume that it's going to be one of the GRR status. Any questions on that? Any clarification for TCQ? Is that correct? It is correct. Okay. So, again, it all starts with record review. You must do that. Determining materials by visual inspection is an acceptable way of completing your inventory, but is not a way to skip the record portion of it. We've had in the various workshops so far been asked, I have a very small system. It's really more of a headache to look through paperwork. I can just go out to the meters and dig them up real quick. You cannot skip this portion of it. You have to do records. If you find that you don't have enough records to really prove up or demonstrate that it is a certain type of material, then you move on to the next step, which would be a visual inspection of some sort. But it's not a way to escape having to review records. And whenever you are collecting these records, it's not something that you have to submit to TCQ. These are for you. This is your documentation. I'm pretty sure TCQ doesn't want all of the extra paperwork. They just want the inventory sheet, and electronically. So for your records review, the initial inventory, there's 5 different components listed of how they want this done: previous materials evaluation, construction and plumbing codes, water system records, distribution system inspection records, and then any other state requirements, in our case, TCEQ. I put an additional note here. It is best management practices to have some kind of SOP of how you are determining, how this is lead, non-lead, galvanized. Interpretation it can vary from one employee to the next. So if you're using various people to go out and do these inspections, or find records rather, it's good to have a set standard of how you're determining this. So the first one, previous materials evaluation. The rule citing water systems must use the information on lead and galvanized iron and steel as identified in 40 CFR when conducting the inventory of a service line and a distribution system for the initial inventory. So you're looking for reporting construction materials used in the distribution system, identifying lead service line materials and subsets of sites, trying to do an evaluation of that, but this was primarily driven from 1991 lead and copper rule, where the systems were required to do a material evaluation before. This was to identify potential lead areas in your system, and this is where you developed your sample siting for your tiered sites. So in a way, we've done this material evaluation in the past. So the idea is that we want to go back to this as first step. What are the documentation and the information that you reviewed to do that part? Start with that. In addition, this required you to use water quality information to identify the locations particularly highly susceptible to lead. So, of course, whenever you were building your sample siting plan or your lead and copper sites, you were to use the more susceptible sites for that to test. So, again, that's what they're referring to here, is to look back at the information you collected then. There was also a requirement for special monitoring and corrosivity characteristics. So this was a part of just looking for lead and solder and pipe, looking for copper lines, galvanized, ferrous, iron and steel, and asbestos. So you built an inventory to some degree at some point in the past. This was prior to my time in water, so I don't quite remember doing this particular step back in this 90s area, but this was in place. Construction and plumbing codes. So the systems must review all construction and plumbing codes, permits, and existing records or other documentation which indicates the service line materials used to connect the structures. So identifying when lead service lines were allowed or specified, you may have documentation that specifically states that particular case. Identify areas that are most likely to have lead service by construction dates or even or construction of line sizes. And I say that because at a certain point, we weren't even allowed to put in a smaller line, so less than 2 inch. So if you have certain sections of your system that say 1.5 inches, you can almost date them back to a particular time, maybe that could be more highly susceptible for lead lines. Review construction and plumbing permits to identify customers and system-owned plumbing materials. So a little additional information on this and some, for background, I guess, is that in 1986, the Safe Drinking Water Act had an amendment for lead-free. So there's a 2-year period from when EPA establishes something for the state to actually adopt it. So in July of 1988, TCEQ adopted that. So that's why they used the 1989 number. So anything built after 89 should be considered to be non-lead because there was a lead ban from 88. So that's why also the lead, the template for the lead service line inventory also asks about this date, and that's the reason why. But when you're looking for construction and plumbing codes, or plumbing records rather, I put a few different locations that you may be able to search, find some information. So city websites may have some of that. A lot of this is city-based, as you can tell. A lot of our maybe rural water supply corporations or districts may not have the particular resources available, but if you do, sometimes on the websites, the clerk's office, code and enforcement. So if you have a planning department for your city, any kind of city archives, and we have found that in some smaller areas, they are located even in the local libraries, or county offices for plat approvals. I don't know that all counties do this. I know we're seeing a lot more of it now because of all the growth, but the counties have to approve certain subdivisions coming in, what they're being built as, the size, what's being installed. So there may be some information, if your county was doing this previously, to be able to search up dates and materials used that way. This was an example. I pulled, you won't be able to read this. I can barely read this, and I'm standing in front of it. But in the EPA manual that you received, there's the spiral document, and also online on that Dropbox link that was shared in the chat, you should be able to download that or find it on EPA's website. It's the guidance manual for lead service line inventories. There's a section here, I noted that it was on page 42. It shows an example of why they're saying look at plumbing codes. It's on this particular section, it says that you shall be made of lead. The service line shall be made of lead and then be labeled as extra strong. So there may be some plumbing codes or ordinances that you've had in cities or even in the counties that materials have to be used. What we're looking for is to see if you can find dates of that and maybe when it stopped. So you can identify anything that was built within that time frame would more likely have lead. Also, in the EPA manual, it states that most lead service lines are 2 inch or less. There are very few cases to where buildings receiving a service were of 3 inches or higher made of lead service lines. So that may be another way to kind of help identify focused areas. If you have large service lines, say going to an apartment complex or a larger building that are above 2 inch, there's a good chance that it's not going to be a lead service line based on just historical information that we've had. County appraisal districts. I did actually include fun in a lead service line inventory workshop. Helpful fun facts. So this is information also in the EPA manual that they were primarily installed in the late 1800s all the way to the 1940s. Some communities continued through 1980s. In one workshop we previously had, someone kind of more of a historian shared some information and I thought was interesting that the use of lead service lines often kind of worked around war times. Because of the metals and materials that we needed for times of war, it would alternate the type of piping materials that we could use for water systems. So it was interesting to note those date ranges of when that may or may not be an impact on your utility of what was installed. Appraisal information by itself is not enough to determine if it is lead or non-lead. And I say that because it will give you information on the customer side. So if you look up your county appraisal district and you can find that a home or building was erected in 2001, That should be, because it's after 1989, it should be evidence enough to show that that is non-lead. However, that doesn't necessarily mean your tap was installed in 2001. So if you can show that in your records that you installed the tap in '01, the building was erected in '01 based on county approval information or county appraisal district information, then those two things together should be enough to say that's non-lead. Those are your records, you reviewed it, that one's checked off. But just keep in mind that there are some cases. So I've seen multiple times to where maybe a service line was put in maybe in the 60s and forever has just run a water trough for a big piece of property. Nowadays, maybe the property was divided, a child decided to build a house there. So that home is going to show that it was built more recently, but that tap was actually installed way prior to 1989. Or it could be vice versa. Your records show that you put a tap in '98, but the actual home has probably been erected since the 40s, but their well has went dry. They just needed a new tap at that point. So you're still trying to make sure it all makes sense, that the home or the piping for the establishment there, the home or building, is actually dated to be the same as your service line. So you can use appraisal information, just consider the scenario. A lot of these are going to be case by case. I do want to go through an example of using the county appraisal districts. I thought it may be helpful to see kind of how it works. Is everyone somewhat familiar, at least in the room, with using county appraisal districts and the interactive maps and things like that? Okay, well then I won't spend too much time on it. But for most part, I believe all counties or county appraisal districts have some kind of interactive map, Biz Consultants, Esri, some type of GIS software where you can do a search and pull up some information on the particular property. So in this case, I looked up mine, and the initial information that pulls up gives you some basics, but it doesn't give you what you're looking for as far as date built. You have to go into it a little further to that view more information. And then you pull up this second set of data here. So from this information, it shows that my home was built in 1978. And you can decipher that I have a lot of home maintenance that I do often, but also that is prior to 1989. So there's a good chance that there could be lead service lines in there. So this is one that you would want to focus on and try to either find more records to determine what it is, or at some point go out and do a visual inspection if you're listing it as unknown. So I know I've talked to TCEQ and even our GIS guy, trying to work with some of the counties to see, typically you can pull information from the county appraisal districts. You can get an Excel sheet exported. You can get shape files to go right into your GIS software. But typically, it only shares the information on that first screen. It doesn't really give the build date. So we're trying to find out ways that they can include that in the export, because you may be able to cross-reference that with all the addresses or connections that you have in your system. And being able to identify that and knock off a good portion of those would be significant time saving. So this is one way to do it. Water system records. So this is all your internal records. And I put some suggestions here about looking to your engineers. Any things that were built, upgrades, capital improvements that you did through your engineers over the years. They may still have some records, some bid lists, materials list of the items used when they bid this out through their contractors. That may give you some information on a particular section. All of the service lines were made of polyline or PVC or copper. So check with your engineers. They may have some information. This may be also another way to check on the customer side. If you can find the engineer that developed a particular subdivision, they may also have that information through whatever contractors they used. So that would possibly address the customer-owned portion of the line. Any government governing documents, so look into your tariffs, your ordinances, service agreements, even in any meeting minutes. There may be a time to where you address that at one point you did use lead lines because they were sturdy, they were easy to use at some point, but you actually made a call in a meeting to say from now on we're using this particular type of material. So think about all of the potential areas that you can research in your documentation. Work orders and tap cards. Tap cards is not really a term that I was familiar with until we kept hearing about it. I know a lot of the older cities that were established here in Texas, they use the term tap cards, but for me, it was work orders. That's just how we did our work. Excuse me. So reviewing all of that information, seeing when taps were installed, of course. If you're not tracking, when you do a new tap, a new service agreement comes in, and you're out to go put in a new service, if you are not currently tracking when you did it, who did it, and even the materials used, I would suggest that you start. This may not be the end of our inventory process. At some point, that may change. Rules may change again to where not only right now lead goosenecks are not lead lines, but it could change. Tracking all of this information and keeping up with it, there may be rules down the road that change as well. There's also other cases, I don't want to get too far off the trail, but to where you needed documentation to get other things done, like alternate capacity requests. I've seen a case to where someone wanted to get a capacity exception, and their usage was great except for one day. They had a major leak, but there was no documentation or work orders to show that that particular day was a leak. So it really threw off their averages and their numbers and weren't able to get that exception. So tracking through work orders and some kind of documentation of all the work you do is important. Standard operating procedures, if you do have a set standard of how you do things. If you have an SOP for putting in a tap, for fixing a leak, for doing any type of services in the field, look back at those. Maybe there were some amendments or changes over the years. Best practices show that any kind of documentation, you have an amendment line at the top or somewhere in the document to say that this has been changed by this person on this date, so you can look at revision dates to see, and you may find an older one that says, in fact, in the SOP that we used this material, this lead line, or this type of fitting. So go back and review to see if you can find anything there. O&M manuals should be basically a collection of all your SOPs, so go back and look in that as well. Distribution maps, also one of the system records. Older sets of maps, as-built. There's been a lot of cases to where I show up on a system and they have, I don't even know what type of paper it is, but I can tell they're very old. That may have some information on there that actually wrote in, it was polyline, it was PVC on the map itself. So reviewing older maps. As I mentioned before, looking for smaller lines. So if you're actually, and I have seen this, that a utility is using a 1 or an 1.5 inch line as a main line. We haven't been able to do that in a long time. So that may give you some indication to start looking in that area because apparently that was probably put in some time ago. And also utilizing GIS. I know we keep mentioning that, and it's not that we're trying to pitch or sell GIS software or anything, but it's just the benefits of using it is very great, especially in a case like this, to where you can not only capture the physical or the geographic representation, but all the information that goes to that particular point. So if you have GIS and you're saving this, this is a good place to collect it all. There are some exporting tips that TCEQ put together, and it should be one document that is on the Dropbox link that was shared in the chat. Excel tips, I believe is what it was called. Different ways to pull information from GIS. So just for one example, Esri has a way that they can export all of your map data and maybe try to get it into the template. So look into that. There's various types of GIS software out there, so each one is going to be a little bit different, but one area to look at. Continuing on. I think I really just said all this, just forgetting that I had a slide to say all this. But I will add that a lot of these software companies now, because of the new rules, they're very aware of it. They're actually including certain features, attributes, layers that are addressed just for lead service line. They know that this is going to be an impact on you all. So collecting it in the field as you go through your normal day process, it's a good way to actually obtain all this information and keep it all in one spot. So again, your software, if you use that, may have these abilities. Service agreements and tariffs. You may be able to locate old tariffs or service agreements that have information in there about materials used, what you did allow for the customer to use, what you use as far as your side of the system. This is more updated information, but I did want to also point out that your newer agreement should show new lead and copper rule information of what the lead percentages are that you're allowed, or that it's lead free rather. So If you can't find anything as far as dated information, anything that would indicate that you allowed lead lines at some point, if nothing else, go back and make sure at least it is current to today's standards. Distribution system inspections and records. Systems must review all inspections or records in the distribution that indicate material composition of the service connections that connect the structure to the distribution system. So as Alex mentioned, CSIs. This should be a really quick go-to to determine what is used on the customer side. Now, we typically gather a lot of the information from internal plumbing or the premise plumbing, but part of a CSI is to also go around the property, the outside of the building, look for cross connections. You should be identifying what the material is that is being used on the property. There is a section for that. So as long as you're keeping up with your CSIs, that is I would say one of the immediate records I would go to. So you should have one for every service connection because you're keeping those. Not only doing them, but keeping them. So look back at that. Okay. Water quality sampling. This is another method to look and see from your prior records and your current records. Any information you've obtained through your monthly, quarter, annual sampling may have indicators of potential lead in service lines. Your past lead and copper sampling may indicate that you have higher levels in certain areas. It may direct you to do a little bit more focus in those spots. So review your sample sites for your tiered LCR. Customer surveys. This was a question that we had early on. And it took a little bit of a conversation, I know, between us to finally ask TCEQ, because I wasn't sure how to ask this, because this is actually putting a lot of reliance on the customer to tell you what they use. And hopefully, in most cases, the customer would be willing to share this information. Now, how much documentation they may have to share with it, it could be hit and miss, but a system can conduct a material survey to the customers, asking if they know the material type on their side of the line. I mean, they installed it, they put it in, they may have information on this. They also may even have receipts. I know a lot of people that are really good about keeping up with their home records. So if they have copies of receipts and willing to share, that's showing the materials, the buy list of what they use to put in the ground or in the home. Also, all documentation, a customer survey is a document that you can use as a record review. So I did ask for a picture, if they can give you a picture. Trying to ask someone that does not speak plumbing or speak water to fill out something like this, it may be good to add a picture with it so you know what they're talking about. They could be looking at the toilet piping and trying to explain that this is in fact, porcelain. It's not what we're looking for. So ask for a picture. Remember that if you are taking a customer survey though, and you're using this as your inventory, that you are certifying at the end of this document, this template, that this is true to the best of your ability. So you're signing off on this. So if you're comfortable using what you receive from your customers, then so be it. But just be aware of that. Contractors and service providers. So similar to how I mentioned about getting with your engineers, you can reach out to the utility contractors that you may use for your everyday fixes, line installations, tap installations. They may still have records of work that they've done for you. They may still have receipts of purchase orders that they've done that can help you with documentation. Also, in small towns, similar to what I live in, there's a handful of plumbers. They probably have done all the work in town. They may be able to be a resource for you as well. If they've worked on a good majority of all of the residents that you serve, they may have information of what type of materials they purchase on a regular basis. So just kind of thinking out of the box of ways to gather information. State requirements, the fifth component that I'm aware of, there's no additional state requirements from TCEQ. We are hounding that record review is a must. We do offer resources. I say we, as in TCEQ does, for things online. There's a lot of resources online. FMT program, as we mentioned at the beginning, is a resource, someone to come out and go through this with you, go through some of your records to kind of show you what we're looking for. EPA provides a lot of guidance. The manuals that you have, there's a lot of good information in there. A majority of this particular section is from that book. So they go through a lot of examples of how other states are doing it, how other systems, some of the success that they're having with some of these methods. So I would definitely take a look at it. So takeaways from the record review. We require a thorough examination of all potential records. So you can't skip it. It is not expected for utilities to go out and start digging up lines. In some cases, it may seem like that's easier than going through paperwork, but you still have to do the paperwork anyway. But it is not expected, because I know that was an initial concern for a lot of people was, if we're having to identify all these lines, that is a significant cost and time to go out and dig everything up. There were a lot of comments about potholing and how much of the yard we're going to have to dig up and all of that. That's not the intention. For initial inventory, they want everything to be done through record review. So there should not be a need for that. And then, of course, exhaust all documentation information prior to having to go out and do visual inspections. Is there anything that hasn't been covered? I got a few more to go over, but just kind of a stopping point. Is there any other records that you can think of in your utility that maybe could be a resource for you that someone else may also have and not be thinking about it?
Bid specifications.
Bid specifications. Yes.
Bid specs, yeah.
Yeah, so yes, if you're putting together projects or jobs, you do have bid specs, the kind of materials that you want in the ground. That should be information that you can gather from an engineer that did the project for you.
Any senior personnel interviews are also accepted?
That's right. So similar to customer surveys for the customer side, TCQ is accepting an interview, so to speak, to say that this person has been here long enough, they watched this particular subdivision go in, they know the material for here, they're signing off that this was all done with polyline, something like that, correct?
That's right, yeah, through an affidavit or some sort of confirmed interview.
Which is very beneficial, because you can knock out large sections from that. But you got to catch them while we have them. That's the big thing for the water industry right now, is everyone's retiring. So hurry up and get those interviews done. All right, next steps. So we went through the various ways you're supposed to be gathering your data. So you're starting your information, your data set, and then now you're working on narrowing down the fields of what you really have to go out and spend more time in. So you've found the information to say that a certain section of your utility or your system is prior or after, rather, 1989. You're narrowing those down. You have documentation, you've dwindled it out. We don't have to worry about those. Those are lead-free. Now you're going through the next ones. So this is where it gets a little bit more in-depth. This is where, in some cases, you got to get a little creative. So after your record review and removing the service lines that have been proving to be lead-free, you're moving on. Your initial inventory does not require that you proceed past record review. You can put unknown. You want to make sure that that is understood, because that was also a common misunderstanding when this rule came about, or at least the conversation of the rule a couple years ago, is that you can't put unknown. You can. Is for initial inventory, it is perfectly fine to do so. Do understand, though, that it will be something that you're going to have to address at some point. Whether it's before October of next year, you can still submit your inventory, but you will have to go out and verify what the material is at some degree. And as Alex mentioned earlier, just to kind of remind everyone that if it is an unknown, we talked about that 30-day requirement to do a public notice. The more unknowns, the more lead, and the more galvanized requiring replacement, all of those are going to require a public notice. So if you put in 500 unknowns, those are 500 public notices that you're going to have to give to those customers. So there is a benefit of actually doing a little bit more intensive work to try to narrow all that down. It's just, for the initial review, it is not expected that you have to go to that extent just yet. Just be aware, you will be addressing it to some degree. So if you do have time, conduct verification methods and update your initial inventory. So suggestion being, get through your inventory, record review, get everything you can, cover all of it. If you do find that you've now done this and you have holes in there to where you have unknowns, now take the time, if you have the time, go ahead and start addressing some of those. Do some of the verification methods that we'll cover in just a minute. So service line investigations. Various ways to do this. These are further explained, again, in that EPA manual, a lot more detail. We're going to touch on these, but you can dig into the weeds for sure in that EPA book. So predictive modeling, we kind of talked on a little bit already. The visual inspections, water quality sampling, and then, of course, excavation. So predictive modeling is a form of data mining that works analyzing historical and current data and generating a model to help you predict what could be out there. This is generally used through AI. It's not necessarily always, but in most cases, to help you determine if maybe a certain section of your utility, in fact, could be high potential for lead lines. There are actually a lot of services, a lot of service providers out there that are doing this with the lead and copper inventories and then even some of the other LCRR rules, but they're using a lot of AI. This can assist with just determining the locations and then help you to prioritize your efforts. So when you have a lot of unknowns and you start to do something like predictive modeling, you know where to at least start. This really is helpful for very large utilities. Documentation and verification is still needed. This is not an end-all. If you have a prediction that this is not lead, that's not necessarily going to fly. As it was mentioned earlier, that it is a case by case. If you can come up with enough data and to kind of back up what you are predicting, it may be just fine. But for most cases, this is a predictive measure. I put an example here, but I think we kind of went over one. This actually may be the example that Philip went through. So he stole a little bit of information from my slide. So I'm not going to spend time going over that. But the idea is that you can do subsets of sampling and try to find some information on a few of, say, a subdivision that was put in at a certain time frame. And it gives you an idea that you can apply that if these particular ones did not have lead, the assumption is all of these did not have lead. But again, you have to verify. We can't assume anything. Visual inspections, as it probably seems, pretty self-explanatory, is going out and even on your normal process of reading meters. I say everyone, a lot of people are moving to the AMI, AMR, the drive-bys, so the process of going to every box is not as common as it used to be. But even with those, I would still suggest, just as prior operator, still go by and read them every now and then. But if you are still reading meters in the manual process anyway, go through, look at the boxes, see what the materials are made of. That's a visual inspection. We're doing some projects now for mapping work that we're going out, and as we're doing the mapping work, we're kind of digging out the lines on both sides just to see if we can go ahead and verify what type of material is being used. So the pictures aren't going to show very well here, or unfortunately not on your handouts either, but this presentation is on that Dropbox link if anyone wants to download it later. The picture on the left shows that there is a metal line. It's a rusted galvanized pipe. You can't really see that, but we can identify what type of material it is just on that visual inspection. On the right, we didn't dig up very much of it, but enough to see that that is white plastic. So that was a visual verification of what type of material is coming on the customer side of the line. So if you're doing something like this, also make sure you're capturing the information on your side as well. Pictures work great. They work great with GIS because you can store all this information. If you have a question about a certain service, you can pull that particular point up. You have all of the documentation that you've gathered. You have a picture associated with it. The scratch swab magnet test. So if you do find a line and you're unsure what type of material, the scratch test is that you can put a small scratch. I want to make sure I emphasize a small scratch into this line. It is a soft material, but you should be able to see the shiny metal come through. This is typically an indicator of a lead line. The swab test, of course, if you do CSIs and you're used to doing the swab on the solder flux, you'll see that you may be able to swab the material to see if it is in fact lead. And then, of course, magnet testing, lead lines are not magnetic. So there's some physical ways that you can identify the type of material it is. Water quality sampling. Again, the EPA manual goes into a lot more detail, but there are a couple different ways that you can do sampling to try to identify what it is. I will say that this is also not a way to completely rule out lead. It's similar to predictive modeling, that if you can show enough data, it may be enough to vouch that this is not a lead line. But just sampling alone by itself is likely not going to be enough. Excavation. This is the one that people have the most concern with, especially on the customer side. We live in Texas. We all probably have fear of walking onto someone's private property. So going out there with machinery and tearing up the grass is definitely a fear. We don't want to do that. And again, that's not the expectation from TCEQ to go out and start potholing someone's yard. If it comes down to having to verify what it is, in most cases you can do like the meter boxes and be able to see the material somewhere close. I know for a lot of the meters that I've seen, typically there's actually even a spigot right past the box, because when a new home is installed, they at least get water service, and then they add to that moving on once the home is built. So there should be some kind of indicators very close to the meter to give you some kind of information on what type of material it is without having to dig. But hopefully if you do get to the point of having to do some kind of excavation, you can do it in the less invasive manner possible. If you do, and it was mentioned already, if you do actually have to do some excavation and you do determine that it is a lead line, you disturb that line to some extent, even just shaking or rattling that line, you do need to notify the customer of the potential increase in lead because you've possibly shaking up some material in there. I'll say this one more time. So TCEQ does not want you to have to complete field assessments. They would really want everything done by record review. So if you can find records from anything in the water system, the counties, the cities, the customer side, any information that they may have, the surveys, there's a lot of different opportunities or resources out there to say you have records. So for a utility to say I have no records, it's really hard to take that, because to some extent there is something out there. And then again, I would just suggest if you don't really have a lot of utility records, this is a good time to start. So that was the methods of gathering. Do we have any questions on that section so far? None here. I know we have some online. Okay.
Yeah, so online, someone asked if a metal detector can be used to detect lead and copper.
No. Yeah, this is like any predictive modeling, it's going to be case-by-case basis. Possibly could identify a portion that you need to look further into, but metal detectors will not be accepted to determine a non-lead.
Well, and I do have a follow-up question for that. So typically on a metal detector, it will identify if it is a pipe, metal pipe whatsoever. So even just using one to say that there was no indication of metal, then it must be PVC, that's still not acceptable, right?
Yeah, it would have to be, used against record, all record review, and then, the predictive modeling proposed again with all of that supporting documentation.
Okay. Were there any other questions online?
No.
Great.